Hey, Jaideep, you have to click on it so that it turns on and lights up.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I hear that people can hear me. So this is Jaideep Kapur. I have no disclosures, actually no financial or commercial relationships or activities that conflict with any of my presentation here. So what I'll do before David tells you exactly how the NIH study section functions is help you think about writing grants and preparing grants for clinical trials, NIH clinical trials. One of the most important pieces of advice I'll give you even before you start writing a grant is to take plenty of time. The most common error that beginning investigators make in terms of writing or preparing a NIH grant is to give themselves too little time. And when I say take plenty of time, what I mean is that take several months. I still am seeing one message saying no sound. I'll turn up my volume so if people can. I've turned up the volume. Does that help? How about this? Is this better? Okay, I'll go on then. So the most important thing, as I was saying earlier, was that you should prepare in plenty of time to for the grant. I'm trying to turn the video on. Does the video work now? Okay. So the first issue to look at a grant in the big picture is to define the problem, to demonstrate that solving that problem will have significant impact. If you happen to work on a common serious disorder such as stroke or traumatic brain injury, it becomes easy because these are common disorders that can have significant impact on lives of people. But if you're working on a disease with low incidence, you have to explain how the advance made in that disease would impact all other disorders, or a new concept would be born, or how your advance is going to change significantly change the treatment of that disorder. And towards the end of your significance section, make sure that you define what would happen if your program is successful. That is, if you come up with a new diagnostic method or new treatment method or new prognostication method, how would it impact the well-being of patients who suffer from that disorder? So assume that you are successful. How does that impact? So you begin by defining the problem, its epidemiology, economic impact, and then defining how you'll change it by your study. Second scored criterion for your grants is innovation. This is a scored criterion. Some of the people struggle with innovation, but remember, it can be technological. That is, you're trying to use a new technique. For example, your institution acquired a 7T MRI, and that allows you to do something that nobody else in the world can do, or somebody's come up with a new sequence for an MRI that allows you to do something, or you have a new biomarker. That's an innovation. It could also be methodological. For example, you are using a novel design for clinical trials, or novel outcome measure is being used that allows you to do that trial much more easily than it would have been possible without that innovation. Sometimes novel technologies come out, and if you're the first one to adopt those novel technologies, again, that's an innovation. I talked about methods in novel clinical trial designs and outcomes. And finally, you can have a novel hypothesis that challenges the existing paradigm, and that make sure that when you come up with a novel hypothesis that is changing the way we think about a disease, you mention that as an innovation, because that's an innovation in thought. So it could be a conceptual innovation, and reviewers would take that also. But make sure that you have a section on innovation in your grant. Make sure that you highlight the how your innovation is driving your application. The next is approach. Approach is the biggest part of most proposals. Your approach is also where reviewers will spend the most amount of their time critiquing, and approach is also where the most common source of criticisms in most grant reviews, as you'll hear in David's presentation. So begin your approach with preliminary data. Preliminary data is critical to demonstrate that you're capable, that your team is capable of performing the proposed project. You can show, and key areas for a clinical trial, obviously, where you can show feasibility is by showing that you can recruit patients, that any of the novel assays, especially if you're going towards some novel fancy assay, don't say that we'll buy the machine and then try it after you give us the grant. Make sure that you demonstrate that that assay, whether it's an MRI or a biomarker or mRNA or some protein assay, you've done it at least a few times so that the study section can believe that you can actually do it. And again, that's a challenge for starting investigators, because sometimes you don't have the funds to do it, or sometimes you don't have the team put together to do it. But that's a critical challenge that you should try to overcome to make sure that you address feasibility through preliminary data. If you have innovations that you're using in your clinical trial that are unpublished, make sure that you include them in preliminary data. As a matter of grantsmanship, I always advise my mentees to publish before submitting a grant. As far as possible, if there is a novel technique or method that you're going to use, try to get it published, reviewed before you submit the grant. But if there is not enough time to do that, you're going to use an unpublished innovation, make sure that it is well defended in the preliminary data section of your grant. Once you have preliminary data, you go into your approach and go aim by aim, clearly delineating how you will accomplish your aims. In a clinical trial, obviously, key factors are that you defend your inclusion criteria, you defend your exclusion criteria, you make sure that that reviewer would agree with you. A reasonable clinician would agree with your inclusion and exclusion criteria. If there are red flags or something that you would think would raise concerns for a reasonable person, then explain it in great detail why you chose that inclusion and exclusion criteria, because it should sound reasonable to a reasonable clinician. Then explain exactly how you'll enroll your patient, where your subject will get enrolled. This courses are being run by ED physicians, so very commonly it could be pre-hospital, in the hospital, in ED, or will it be in an ICU, will it be in an outpatient setting? But you want to be very clear as to where that would occur and how it would occur, not just where would occur and how it would occur. Then explain the intervention, explain exactly what a drug you're going to give. If it is a drug, you want to tell them enough about its pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. It's why did you choose the dose that you choose to give? Why does that dose make sense? Is it safe? Is it efficacious? And how did you come to that conclusion? So don't just mention a drug and its dose if it's a drug. explain why you chose that drug for that, and why did you choose that specific dose or set of doses for that drug. So the next approach is a primary outcome, where again, primary outcome is the most critical part of this experiment that you're going to do, and it must be very clearly stated, easy to understand, but you also want to make sure that it is feasible, reproducible, sensitive, and specific. There is a criterion that NIH is becoming very worked up about, which is rigor and reproducibility of your research. And they want to make sure that your primary outcome is reproducible, that especially when you're doing a multi-center trial where there will be 50, 60, or 70 people trying to determine the primary outcome, it must be such that everybody can do it, and it can be done in a way that is reliable, that is all people measure the same thing, same way. So justify it, take your time justifying it. Secondary outcomes, just basically justify each one as to why it is important to get. The statistical plan is often in a companion application, so you don't have to go over it in great detail. However, make sure that you justify expected sample size and effect size. Very often people fall into the temptation of defining a sample size based on convenience. I can recruit 100 patients, therefore the effect must be 25%. That's very transparent to reviewers who are experienced, who have suffered through many clinical trials. So make sure that when you pick your sample size based on a reasonable effect size that you're expecting, and work around it, because not the other way around, that is picking the sample size and then defining the effect size. Recruitment is a common problem, one of the major problems for clinical trials, so you want to be very conservative in estimating recruitment. Another sort of error that we all tend to make is to be overly optimistic about how many subjects we can recruit. The reviewers tend to be overly pessimistic, and they'll say, oh, no, never would you be able to recruit that many subjects. So so be careful, justify why you're so sure that you will have sufficient number of subjects to enroll for your study, because again, that's a common weakness in a clinical trial that you're designing. Of course, you want to make sure that you include women, children, minorities. This is a brief mention here in your safety plan, and in human subjects you will have plenty of space to do it, but a mention in the main body of the application touching on key points that you're aware, and you're going to do everything to make sure that those groups are included. If you're going to exclude any of those groups, make sure that you mention it in the main application and then justify it in later in your safety plan or in human subject section. But it should be touched upon in your grant. Next is environment and investigator. Environment-wise, if you're working within your institution, make sure that all institutional resources are listed. All institutional resources that are relevant to performing that clinical study or clinical trial are listed. So, and these include equipment, infrastructure, and people that can help you make sure that your project will be successful. So help the reviewer understand the environment in which you're working. If you happen to work in a big name institution, this is easier because you can point to all the resources. But if you are in a small institution, again, this is where you take special care to make sure that reviewer is well aware that you have all the infrastructure resources necessary to perform the trial. And if you don't have it, how would you access those resources? For example, if you're going to use resources at another nearby institution, which is only a mile away, make sure you explain that it is easy to get to. It's not like it will take you 3 days to get to this institution to use their resources. If you're using network resources, make sure that entire network resources are listed in your grant, and you explain exactly how that network makes those resources available for individual studies. Often these networks will have boilerplate language about their resources, so you can use that. Often in individual institutions such as mine has a lot of boilerplate language available for using for infrastructure and equipment, but again, you want to make it relevant to your particular application when you go do it. So this environment is one area where you can easily score good points. You only can make a mistake by missing this. For an investigator, there's a typo here. BioSketch form lets you define who you are and why you are qualified to do this study. And be sure to mention all your strengths. If there are weaknesses in that you have that are very clear to you and to anyone else, for example, you've never done a stroke study, you've always done traumatic brain injury studies, you can go in and show that you have collaborators or joint PIs or consultants who will walk you through this process. Don't go in to a grant where your expertise or mastery of the field can be challenged. And if it is to be challenged, you should have collaborators to help you out to navigate through that. There is an online tool to create the BioSketch, my NCBI. I use that. Many institutions can help you prepare your BioSketch. There are very clear requirements from NIH as to how it should be structured. And this is one of those items that many grants offices will want ahead of time so that they can go through and make sure that your BioSketch is done accurately. So again, the next part is timing, and in terms of grant preparation, the admin timing. The administrators in your institutions are your friends. Remember that they are hired to make sure that your institution gets more and more NIH and other grants. Even though when you're young you feel that these are bureaucrats who are getting in the way of doing science, they in fact are people who are well experienced in submitting grants to NIH and other institutions. They understand what it takes to submit a grant. So work with them, plan ahead. These are people you should get to know as soon as you join the faculty and plan to do research. Have a relationship with them, keep them informed as to when you plan to submit a grant. I often let my grants administrator know 6 to 8 months ahead of time that I plan to submit a grant. Help them with administrative planning. If there are subcontracts in a multi-center trial, it's very important to give them time to get those done, especially getting site budgets, support letters, subcontract negotiations. They take a lot of time, so it's good to get started on that very early. Prepare your budget early, be prepared to revise it. If as you're writing the grant you realize you forgot to ask for a specific item, you can go back and revise it. But if you have a skeleton budget done with your administrator ahead of time, they know where to add or change any part of your budget. It's important to justify every item on your budget, especially people, especially if the budget is non-modular. In modular budgets, you can get away with minimal explanations, but it still is good. I, as a matter of habit, even in modular budgets, explain expenses just so that the study section knows why I need the money. But if it's a non-modular budget, you have to take your time writing the justification for the budget. Of course, you know that if you have a more than $500,000 per year NIH grant, then you have to get their permission to submit a grant. Again, give plenty of time to the NIH grants official to get that done. They are usually supportive, helpful, especially if they think Uh, uh, and that also helps you because they're the ones who will be present during the review. So again, engage them early, especially in big grants. Again, for support letters and institutional support letters, meet early. This is something that can be done way ahead of time. It doesn't have to wait till the last moment. So again, as I started this, I said, give yourself plenty of time, and I'm ending the grants preparation by talking about giving yourself plenty of time to do this. The last part is what are the parts of the summary statement, and David will spend quite a bit of time explaining to you how that summary statement is generated, but I'll just give you the sections of the summary statement that you'll get. Those of us in old times, and these used to be called pink sheets because they were printed on pink paper, but these are now called summary statements. They'll tell you what review group reviewed you, and so you can look at, and at the end of the summary statement is a listing of all the people that participated in the review, whether they were physically present or called in by phone or just sent in a written review. Their name will appear at the end. Of course, you know that you're not to contact any of the members of your review group. Then next is your score. They give you a score ranging from 10 to 90. 10 is perfect, 90 is almost never used because you get 2 stars instead. So what happens is the study section gives you a range of scores, and if your score is in the top 50th percentile, that is top half of those grants reviewed in writing originally, then only it gets discussed in a study section. If the score is below, in the bottom half of the pile, it doesn't get discussed, and 2 stars are given. I want to assure you that sometimes very good grants don't get discussed. Just because it wasn't discussed doesn't mean don't resubmit. Be very careful to read the review, have an experienced reviewer read the review and tell you whether it is worth resubmitting or not when you get a triaged grant. Then, if the grant was discussed at study section, a summary of discussion is prepared by the scientific research officer or SRO who sits with the panel and takes down their impressions. This is very important part of the review. This is what exactly was spoken about your grant. You get to hear what the reviewers said about you, and reviewers bring up the most important and salient features of their review to the discussion. So that tells you what is the salient criticism and what is not a salient criticism. If it wasn't salient, it wouldn't be brought up at reviews. So that's the part. Other scored criteria are significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. I just went over each one of these with you, so they'll each be scored. Remember that overall score is not an average of these scores. Overall score is overall impact of that grant based on all these criteria. There are lots of things that are discussed after scores are given, so they're not supposed to impact your scores, but your reviewers are aware of all of these things, so even if they don't discuss them before giving scores, they're aware, and these definitely include budget and period of support. Again, budget should not impact your score, but I've heard many reviewers take that into account, and SROs screaming, no, you can't discuss budget in score. But just be aware of that. All other parts of the application that are discussed after scores are very important and should be complete. I'll stop there. So I'm going to advance the next slide, but I think David will pick up from here. Hello? Hello?
Okay, can you hear me now? William, can you hear me? All right, excellent. Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Jaideep. I appreciate you covered a lot of certainly the important stuff. What I wanted to do is just kind of cover these four specific questions that you see here. And then really, and I'm going to do this relatively short so that we can open this up to questions for those that, because I think that's where the money is. If you have questions about the process, hopefully we can answer some of those. So the four questions that I really want to address are what study section love and hate in a grant, and I have a list of those items as I have seen them over the years, and I've been reviewing these things now for about anywhere from 12 to 15 years, almost every year, a study section or two. And then what happens during study section? It's sort of like a closed door meeting, and so a lot of people wonder what's going on in there. And then a little bit about the review criteria. Jaideep already discussed it quite a bit. And then ND, what does ND mean? So let's talk about what study sections hate. And I think primarily you will see these are common sense items, but they're very easy to fix or very easy to make sure that you get this right. So sloppiness in grammar, that's just such a huge deal. I can't tell you that if I read the opening paragraph of an abstract and there are just one or two sort of silly grammar errors, I'm already annoyed. I know it sounds crazy, but I am. And I can tell you the other reviewers are as well. So just make sure that you have other people read and edit this, not necessarily for content, but just to make sure that it flows smoothly and that you have good English and good grammar. This is going to be particularly important if English is not your primary language. And we get a number of these, so you want to be very careful with that. The other thing is sort of pushing the limits of font size and space and margins. A lot of these are read. The reviewers have multiple grants to read, and when everything is packed in there too tight, it can be very painful. So those are just sort of some basic structural issues. Now sort of down into some of the other more important grant-specific stuff. The biggest problem that I think we see certainly from junior or people who are first time submitting is they'll have too many aims. So it'll be multiple aims that they're trying to prove, or the aims will be just too ambitious. So keep it simple, keep it clean, and where you can very easily connect the dots between your specific aim and your outcome, and that you can prove that you can do the study. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Another potential flaw is dependent aims. Sometimes these are required, but for the most part, these are a death knell to a grant. So if you have one particular aim that if that aim does not succeed, you really can't do the second part of your study. And the second part of your study is, a very significant piece or half of it, then that's a real problem. So you might want to consider somehow just having one aim and somehow bundling it together so that that's your pilot or your preliminary data is this one aim, and not make one dependent on another, because it'll end up becoming your grant will get hammered for that. We see a lot of times lack of serious statistical support. Now, this is the way, I'm going to tell you the way this is figured out, not only on almost all panels, certainly on the clinical trials panel for NINDS, there are statisticians on that panel. They can read these things and they can tell that someone who didn't really know, or maybe had just an MPH and went to school and was trying to do statistics, wrote this statistical section. The other way that they look and know how serious the statisticians are that are involved is they look at the budget. So if you've got a statistician on your grant for 1% to 2%, 5%, then that's a problem. They're going to pick that up really quickly and say, this person doesn't have serious statistical support. So your statistician is your friend. Embrace them, bring them in early in your grant process, and make sure they have good support on the grant, and that they're not writing their section in isolation. So I think, and I won't spend any more time on the next discussion on poor justification for your approach. As Jaideep said, that the approach is the area that gets the most critique in grants, and the one that you need to spend a lot of time on. And then he also alluded to that if your budget is exorbitant or looks like it's padding, then even though that's not technically supposed to be in the review where you get your scores, it weighs on the minds of the reviewers. It just does. Okay, let's move to the next slide. And then, so what study section loves, obviously, is clean, a very hypothesis-driven, where the hypothesis clearly, easily provable and links to a good outcome, and where if that outcome is proven, then significant change in the field will be made. That's the best way to encapsulate what we love to read, and it's actually, you know it when you read it. You go, oh my goodness, this is really good. And a lot of that is just because it's clean, it's done well, it's done not necessarily simple, but straightforward. The other thing that we love to see is that that you actually have proof that you can do the study, and this hits home a lot. If you're talking about enrolling lots of patients in some special subgroup, or where it's relatively complex to enroll them, if you don't have any pilot data that shows that you can enroll these patients, you're going to be in trouble, and that's going to be a moderate or a major flaw you'll see in the scoring system, which will drop your score. Everything else could be a 1 or 2 or 3, and that single item can drop your score down to a 5 or 6 or 7 or 9. So it's a really important one. Show that you can somehow, that you have the experience to enroll these people, either from pilot data or from really solid estimates from the hospital or from wherever you're enrolling the patients from. The other is, we use the 1 to 10 rule here. So if you look at your patients and you have 10 patients coming in with a particular type of disease, you better estimate that you can only enroll 1 of those 10. And somehow that always seems to pan out that that's pretty much the number that works. And those are the numbers that the reviewers are sort of rolling in their head. So if you think you can enroll a third of your patient population that comes in with something, you're probably overestimating it, and it'll show up in your review. The NIH and NINDS have a lot of new grant mechanisms that are go, no-go grants. It's unbelievable that grant writers forget to put this in their grant, but they do. They'll have a very beautiful grant, but then they will not go to the next step and say, what is the decision for go, no-go? And then when we go, what are we going to? So I think that's really important to bring up. We already talked about stats, so we don't need to talk about that. Okay. So what happens in study section behind those closed doors? I don't know how many of you know the play the Angry 12 Men, or 12 Angry Men. I'm dating myself with this analogy, but anyway, it can seem scary. Actually, review is a lot of your colleagues, mostly senior colleagues, although they do have some associate and even a few assistant professor level people who are on these review panels. But most of these people are your peers and colleagues, many of them in areas of specialties that you're in. And it's a nice mix. So for example, the NINDS panel has emergency medicine doc on it, has neurosurgeons on it, has neurologists on it, and statisticians. So a whole variety of different people with different levels of expertise who are the SRO, or the program, the officer tries to, the scientific review officer tries to assign grants to those people who have expertise in those areas. So they do try to match that up. This is a very typical, if you will see this picture here, it's a very typical layout, although there's less paper now. This was taken quite a few years ago where people actually brought paper and their computer. Now it's all done on computer. But sit around the room and discuss your grant, which is somewhat daunting, frankly. So what are they looking at? And Jaideep discussed this a little bit, but I just kind of want to go a little more into detail on this because this is important, both for your sanity, but also so you know what your score really means to you. So if you look at this scoring is 1 through 9, and you see over there where it says high impact, moderate impact, low impact. And the high impact is really referring to the totality of the project. So not just is it traumatic brain injury an important area, but if your grant is successful, will it really move the field of traumatic brain injury? And how successful will you be? In other words, how well did you design it so that it has a high chance of success? The scores, 1 being obviously perfect and 9 being poor, I want you to kind of take a look at 5, because 5 is a cut point where when your grant is being reviewed, a lot of times this is where the SRO, or the scientific review officer, will discuss internally with the group whether to not review this formally when the panel gets together. You'll still get your individual reviews from the folks that it was assigned to, but it won't actually be discussed. And that's the non-discussed, or the ND that we were talking about. But it's still a good grant. So if you look at that, you can have a 5 and it still be a good grant, but it's just not in a range that's going to be fundable. And so moving to the next, which is again the same scale, but gives you a little bit more granular detail on what makes something good versus exceptional. So look at the good again, 5, and you see strong. So it's a strong grant, but at least 1 moderate weakness. So 1 moderate weakness gets you a 5. So you have to, this is where, you know, if you in your sample size you screw up, or if you don't clearly explain how you're going to be able to enroll the patients that I was referring to before, and you don't link something very good to an outcome, that's a moderate weakness, and automatically it's hurt your study. So this is why you have to be very meticulous and careful with these core elements that are looked at to determine whether your grant is good or not. So it doesn't mean if you get a 5 or if it's not discussed, it's not a good grant. It means it needs some work in the eyes of the reviewers. So just to sort of give you the process of the day, it's more for just FYI than anything, but that group gets together, they all sit down. There is a chair of the group that sits up front, the section group leader, and they'll go around with the first grant of the day, and they'll say, okay, everybody give your preliminary scores. So this, your grant was assigned to anywhere from 5 to 9 reviewers, depending on the study section. And it was reviewed by those individuals, and they preliminary wrote reviews, sent them in early before they got together as a group, and assigned those scores to each of the sections that Jaideep talked about. And then they gave you a total score. So when the group gets together, the first thing is to pull up the grant, say, okay, we're discussing, you know, John Smith's grant today, this is the title, and they'll do preliminary scores. Then you have there's a new process for NINDS. It's not new now, it's been several years, but they'll have a scientific foundation reviewer who is assigned to review the preliminary data. So is the animal science good enough to move this into clinical study? That's a relevant issue in your grant. There's actually someone who's assigned, who's a basic scientist usually, who says this is the evidence, the body of evidence, and it is strong enough to move this forward into a clinical arena. So they will give their comments. And then your assigned reviewers will begin to talk. The first one who will give background and overview of the whole grant is your primary reviewer. This person has a lot of power because they are the ones who sort of determine how it's presented and the initial issues related to the strengths and weaknesses. And then the other reviewers will go around and say their pros and cons to the grant. And then it's open to the floor to the other reviewers in the room. There may be 30 people or 40 people in the room to comment and ask questions of the reviewers, or they're sitting there looking at your grant as the reviews are going on, looking for specific items, and they'll ask. And then everybody comes back together and gives a final score. And even the people who didn't primarily review it are scoring. So they're scoring based on what they heard the ones who actually read it discuss. And then later a budget is done, and that's it. And that's where you get your score. We'll not go through this, but each grants type has some specific items that are considered in the review process. And this is available, by the way, online at NIH. So just a few things about the review criteria, as Jaideep said. The overall impact is not an average, as he said. It is really, again, does this study have a chance of being successfully performed? And if it is, would the outcome change the disease or change the field for this disease? That's really what the overall impact is. So it takes into account the ability for you to complete the trial, and takes into account the significance of what you're asking or what you're trying to find out, bundled into one score. Then are the individual scores, as we talked about. Is it significant? Is it incremental advance, or is it change the field? Investigators, experienced experts, stats, those are the sections, people they're looking at. And then, as we mentioned, approach is probably the one that gets the most dings during review section. So we just sort of briefly said something about not discussed, and again, it's not as, it doesn't mean you're doomed. Now, if you got 9s, that's bad. But look at your review, and if it could have been good with just one moderate flaw, or it could have been good with multiple minor flaws. And so, you know, if your score was a 5 or a 6. So take a look at it, learn from it, and rewrite it. You can reapply for most of these grants. So what I want to do is just sort of give you a little bit of something to go on from the standpoint is this process is like baseball. That's the analogy I like to use. It works very well for pretty much all aspects of this, but really it is a batting average, right? So even the best baseball players on the planet have a batting average of 200 to 300, which means 2 to 3 out of 10. And so this is not dissimilar to that. And the more times you're up at bat, the better you get at bat and the better your chances are. So again, don't be disappointed by your first negative, second negative, third negative, fourth negative. Eventually you will start hitting if you're responding to the reviewers and rewriting and crafting it well. You'll eventually get there. But it does take work and it is disappointing up front. But just want to make sure that that you keep your head up and you keep driving. And that's all I have, William. Questions? Joy, did you are you going to come on, or Will, are you going to say anything?
I think people will start to put their questions into the box over there. I put a question in for you, David and Jaideep. I'll give the microphone back in a second. But sometimes you have a grant that has lots of comments from the reviewers. Some, as you said, there can be up to 10 sometimes. You have one page as your introduction to your revised application. How do you address all the pages and pages of comments when you only have one page to make those statements?
So that one page is a summary, and so you look at the major issues, and now when they do reviews, they're supposed to put whether they thought their critique was a minor, a moderate, or a severe issue, and you look at those and you spend that real estate, which is very precious real estate, addressing those severe or moderate problems that they had, and collapse into groups some of the others. Like if there were, you know, minor changes around something, several different things, you can just sort of put those. Please see, thanking the reviewers. Please see this on page A, B, and C. I actually, and I don't know if they like this anymore, but I used to do an appendix where I literally had every single reviewer comment in one column, and in another column what our comments were and what we changed it to, and we have that sent in one so that we can make sure that we really respond to every comment and didn't miss something, but it also helps summarize in that single page that you have up front in your response. Yeah, William says that's probably not allowable anymore in FOAs. I still send them in. Any other questions? I'm looking at the chat box. So William asked, how has the structure of your grants changed based on what I have observed as an insider, presumably meaning a reviewer? I think what I learned is two things. One is what really, and that's the first list of problems, is what reviewers hate to see. I really learned what they comment on the most. The lack of attention to having a good statistician engaged, all of the things that I mentioned at the very beginning that reviewers hate. I also learned how to structure the specific aims, which is really, really a critical piece. And by the way, there's a fantastic web instruction / support for how to do a specific aims. It's not NIH, but it is really beautifully done. And while y'all are asking another question, I'm going to go see if I can get the web link for it and provide it to you.
I think it looks like we might be getting one more question from the audience, but I think we'll probably be almost in a position to adjourn. I think maybe I'll hand the microphone just briefly back to Dr. Kapur to see if after this he has any other reflections while we wait for that question to come in. So I'll hand the mic back over to Jaideep. And I think maybe Jaideep had to leave, or his microphone isn't working. Dr. Mishra has, what do you do when your grant score oscillates between 50s to 30s and not discussed? Oh wait, there's Dr. Kapur. I actually had that happen to me, and I submitted it to a different institute that funded it. That was, but I don't know that will always work. Let me hand the microphone back over to Jaideep, and then we'll give the baseball player the last word. This isn't exactly what David Wright looks like, at least the one that you'll see around conferences. Whoops, Jaideep, you'll have to hit the button up at the top. Let me turn myself off and then click yourself on.
I just wanted to let everyone know that I put in the chat box the link for this bioscience specific aims page. And I would encourage you to go look at it because it's very well done and discusses the hook, the known information gap in knowledge and critical need that you need to put in the aims.
And we also have our webinar on specific aims by Dr. Silverglite, which is quite good. I'm going to try to give the microphone back to Dr. Kapur. If you move up and press that microphone button after it turns white, we should be able to get a microphone back to you. If not, you're just going to have to mime whatever your final discussion for the viewers is today.
All right, I think this should work, right? So the only piece of advice that I was going to give is to make sure that your grant is read by an experienced reviewer before you submit it, and give it to them at least a month ahead of the deadline for submission. Experienced reviewers can give you a lot of insight into your strengths and weaknesses and how to fix the weaknesses. So that's all I had to say.
And I think I'll hand it back to Joy, and she can give you the instructions for getting CME. And thank you, everybody, for your attention. And please join me in thanking our speakers.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So thank you to our presenters today. Really appreciate you presenting regarding the study sections. And for Dr. Wright getting up so early from Hawaii, so much appreciated. Please evaluate the webinar to give us feedback and help us improve the series. So the link is in the web links pod below. It's the first link there. Just click on that link and then click on Browse To, and then it'll go straight to that evaluation. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 AMA PRA Category 1 credit. So if you wish to claim the credit, you will be asked to provide an email address on the evaluation form. And just note that all CMEs will be provided at the end of the webinar series in November. So the webinar and slides will be posted on to the course website, and the next webinar will be on November 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic will be on changes to the Common Rule. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to our presenters, and we'll talk to you next month. Thanks.